In our last two lectures, we examined two famous Romans who represent the intellectual achievement of the 2nd century A.D. The teacher Epictetus, the ideas of Stoicism, and Apuleius, whose golden ass is a magnificent allegory on the fate of the human soul in an age which paid ever-increasing attention to the salvation of the soul. And we saw how the monotheism of Epictetus and Apuleius' belief in a divine Savior together represent those forces out of which Christianity would ultimately emerge as the official religion of the empire. The ideas of Christianity may be unique, but to those Greeks and Romans who would accept Christianity, certainly the notion of a supreme God who had sent his Son as a Savior resonated with ideas already current in the 1st and 2nd century A.D., ideas current from the highest level of society right down unto slaves. The intellectual achievement of the 2nd century A.D. is also revealed in its history and biography. It was the age in which classical biography, the writing of lives, and the classical concept of history reached their apex. In our first lecture, we noticed that the Romans, like the Greeks, were a historically minded people. And one of the first major impacts upon Roman society from Greece, apart from religion, came in the form of the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides. Cato the Elder learned Greek, not just for diplomatic purposes, but so he could translate these historians and understand their message for Rome. Polybius wrote certainly for his contemporaries in the Greek world, but also to inform the Romans about the importance of history as a means for judging the present. And history meant not anonymous social and economic forces, but lives, great men and women who transformed events. The classical concept of history is one fundamentally at odds, I think, today with our own approach to history. For us today, history is about facts. It is about weaving these facts into an interpretation. It is about analyzing historical forces and historical events. But few historians would say to you that the reason you learn history, the reason you read biographies, is to make yourself better. That the purpose of history is to make us better as citizens and better as individuals. But the classical conception of history, from its beginning in Herodotus and Thucydides, right on up to our figure today of Tacitus of the 2nd century A.D., this history had as its purpose moral instruction. Herodotus taught the lesson of hubris, that outrageous arrogance brings an individual to ruin. And that this hubris, which is a sin, which is a moral wrong, embodied in a leader, will ultimately bring that leader's nation to ruin and many innocent people. Thucydides taught less directly, but less forcefully, the idea of hubris. The outrageous arrogance of the Athenians ultimately brought about their fall and ruin. And he specifically tells us, Thucydides does, that he has written his history as a possession for all time. Because human nature never changes. And what happened in the past will happen again in our own day, unless we are willing to learn from the past. Both Herodotus and Thucydides believed in the importance of individual lives. When describing the great story of the Persian Wars, Herodotus makes it into the story of Xerxes. It is the figure around which the events circulate. He is what gives direction to the story. He is the leitmotif running through it. And Thucydides will step back at critical moments from his history to give us the lives of Themistocles, Pausanias, Pericles. For in these lives is the very fabric of history. The 2nd century A.D. was consumed with an interest in famous lives. Figures of philosophers, figures of political importance. Why, they could even sell a book on famous prostitutes and their lives. And it is another focus which the 2nd century A.D. shares with ourselves, with our own 20th century. President Clinton's favorite reading is presidential biographies. Autobiography, tell-all stories can be magnificent bestsellers. And in Rome of the 2nd century A.D., the two most influential biographers would write their magnificent stories. Plutarch of Chaeronea and Suetonius. Both of them Roman citizens. Plutarch writing in Greek, Suetonius writing in Latin. Plutarch came from a very wealthy family. His family had long been distinguished in the area around Chaeronea, and he in fact would become a priest of the oracle at Delphi. This was a recognition of his family's prestige and wealth and importance. He was an enormously learned man. He had spent years studying, spent much time in Rome, was a very close friend of the Emperor Hadrian. And I believe that the Emperor Hadrian played a role in commissioning and encouraging Plutarch to write his lives of the noble Greeks and Romans. For Rome was the bearer of the culture of classical Greece. Emperors like Trajan and Hadrian saw in classical Greece the source for those moral and political values that would bind the empire together. And what better way of showing how closely linked Greece and Rome were than to parallel a life of a famous Greek with a life of a famous Roman? Plutarch wrote numerous philosophical works. He wrote a study of Isis and the worship of Isis, in which from a mystical and philosophical point of view, he explained the mysteries of Isis as part of the workings of the will of the supreme God of the universe. And that it was not simply a cult into which you were initiated, but partook of the mysteries of God himself. He could write a wonderful work on how to raise a child, filled with tenderness, filled with the idea that a child must grow up to be humane and can only learn that humaneness from his parents. That from the earliest days we should not turn a child over to a nanny, but raise them ourselves, teach them how to write with our own minds. And they will grow up to be reflections of ourselves. And that reflection will be good as long as we educate ourselves for the duties of parenthood. And Plutarch dreamt of the greatness that had one day been Greece and sought to revive that pride that Greeks could have in their achievements. They were not the little Greeks, as Romans sometimes called them in the 2nd century A.D. They were the heirs of a magnificent tradition. And Plutarch's lives tend to focus upon the golden age of Greece. Theseus, but more particularly Pericles and Nicias and Alcibiades. A few lives from the age after Alexander, but for Pericles, for Plutarch, Alexander represents the apex of the achievement of the Greek world. And figures like Demetrius are paltry little creatures who show us how not to live our lives, how not to squander our opportunities. And he pairs them with Romans from the free republic. There's not a life of Tiberius there or some of the creatures of the imperial age. focuses upon Quintus Fabius Maximus, upon the great figures like Marcellus, upon Romulus, upon Caesar himself, who for Plutarch is the counterpart of Alexander. He tells us in his Life of Alexander why he writes these biographies. It is to improve you morally, so that we can all learn about virtue and we can learn about character. See, Plutarch believes in this old-fashioned word character. You can imbue a child with character, and you can imbue yourself with character. And character is all about practicing virtue. It is about practicing, as Cicero tells us, and Plutarch was a great admirer of Cicero. It is about learning of wisdom. It is about justice. It is about moderation. And one of the most constant themes of Plutarch is moderation. But it is also about courage, standing up for what is right. And he says you learn more about the character of an individual from maybe an anecdote than you do from an elaborate discussion of a battle or a siege. Learning all about the terms of a treaty is far less important than a story that illuminates the character of a man. As when Alexander treats the mother of Darius with such courtesy and honor. It would be excessive to murder her just because her son was a coward, or her son had mutilated the innocent Greek soldiers he had found when he captured a hospital. Instead, Alexander treats her with all dignity, and her response is, I wish Alexander were my son. It tells you about the greatness of soul of a mighty warrior. And in his Life of Pericles, Plutarch starts with an anecdote about Caesar. He says one day Caesar was walking down the street and he saw these people with all these little puppies. Wealthy people holding lapdogs and petting them and seeing that their teeth were brushed and they got little haircuts. And he said, is that the kind of children you people raise? Are you some strange aliens that have these little puppies for babies? Well, of course not. Then why do you lavish attention upon brute beasts that should be spent upon your own kind? First see to humans. And Plutarch says that is a statement of virtue, that your first care should be for other humans. And he said, virtue should be for us like a magnet. When we look at the life of a Caesar or a Pericles, we should be drawn to emulate him. Plutarch would no doubt disapprove of many of the subjects of biographies today with their scandal. Study noble things and fill your mind with deeds of nobility. Small wonder that the founders of our country, who believed in nobility and virtue, thought that sets of Plutarch should be purchased and put into every library in this country. Suetonius' approach to biography was somewhat different. He did not come from the kind of distinguished family that Plutarch did, but he rose high, he had significant friends, and became a major administrator under the emperors Trajan and Hadrian. He was in particular in charge, it would seem, of the library of the emperor, which was a very important task, of literary instruction for the emperor, and also in charge of writing his correspondence, and had a great deal of trust until, for reasons that are not entirely clear, he was summarily dismissed by Hadrian for being too familiar with the empress. And whether this meant something serious or whether it meant that the empress just got mad at him for not paying her the proper respect, we don't know. But nothing more serious happened to Suetonius. He continued on with his writings and left a series of works on famous grammarians. He is the author of the work on famous prostitutes that I mentioned to us. He also wrote a life of Virgil. But what has come down to us, most importantly, are his lives of the Caesars. of the 12 Caesars, from Julius Caesar through Domitian. These were sponsored, I believe, by the Emperor Trajan. And I think the lives had a political purpose. And it is a purpose of making Trajan look all the grander by portraying the faults of most of his predecessors. Caesar emerges as he must, as a great man. Augustus, upon whom Trajan patterned himself, is a great man. And Vespasian was a worthy emperor. The rest, as we read the lives of Suetonius, and perhaps in fact as well, were idiosyncratic, eccentric, at best more interested in their personal pleasures than in the rule of the empire. Suetonius is an accurate writer. He also makes use of documentary sources. Being in charge of the imperial correspondence in the imperial library, he could go back and look at the actual letters of emperors. So when he is describing the life of young Claudius, he quotes to us the letters from Augustus to his wife Livia, saying, "Your grandson amazes me. He can carry on an intelligent conversation." So when he is talking about the two sides of Claudius, the idea that he was a simple fool, and the idea, in fact, that he was hiding his considerable abilities under a mask to survive, Suetonius gives us information that we can make our own opinion from. He made use of coins. It is Suetonius who describes for us the coin struck by the Emperor Augustus, showing his birth sign of Capricorn, and he tells us about the coin of Nero, in which Nero is portrayed as a lyre player. So he makes use of a wide range of sources, and he also understands that biography ought to be engaging. He breaks up his subject matter into specific themes, generally talking about the birth, and then about their civil and foreign policy. And then he gets down to what people really find interesting, their private lives. And he details the poisoning of Britannicus by Nero. He details the affairs of a Nero. He tells us what the Emperor Galba's sexual preferences were. He gives us a portrait of the foibles of the great men, and yet coming through is a lesson. And that lesson is those emperors who are morally corrupt, those emperors like a Nero, who are base in their sexual appetites, are the reflection of a society which is itself corrupt, and that we cannot separate public from private morality. That a sexually corrupt ruler will be a bad ruler in civil and in foreign policy. It is a lesson which we still debate today. For Tacitus, the theme of corruption is a thread running through his great historical writings. He came from an old family, and he rose to the heights of the imperial administration. He does not hide the fact that he profited under the reign of a Domitian. He was advanced by Domitian. And in fact, in 97 AD, he would hold the consulship. He believed that no matter how evil the government might be, God had placed him in a position of trust, and he must carry out his duty, not step back and just wash his hands and wait, as he did, for better times. And so he welcomes the rise of Nerva and celebrates Nerva and Trajan as those who have reconciled what was once thought to be forever separate: imperial rule, the Principate, and freedom. And now he says we are free to say what we think. And in this new age of freedom, I look back to the past. I wish, Tacitus said, that I could write of the really great events of the old free republic. But now peace is such that history threatens to become boring. And the grand men of the past, so many in the time of Scipio, are now reduced to a very few. He wrote, in preparing for his greater task, 3 monographs: a work on the Germans, a work on oratory, and a life of his father-in-law. And each of these works has a message for us. Each of us shows the brilliance of Latin style, for Tacitus was one of the most evocative of all Latin writers, using a subtle, sometimes harsh, elegant, ancient form of Latin, sometimes with archaic words that make the reader ponder. He is like Thucydides, who was his master. He is not easy to read, and every word requires thought. And frequently he tells us more by what he does not say than what he says. His work on oratory is in the form of a dialogue, and its central question is, why is oratory dead in our day? Why in the 2nd century A.D. are there no more great speakers? Oratory, he says, is the mark of a free people. We have today, he says, though certainly Trajan and Nerva are different than this, but in a figure like Domitian from our recent past, we constantly have emperors who have others write their speeches for them. The first to do this was Nero. Even as I think one of the last American presidents to write his own speeches was Woodrow Wilson, sitting there with a battered typewriter, writing his own speeches. So when an emperor no longer cares to speak to his people in his own words, then he must feel there is no need really to persuade them. And he himself lacks the principles to convey his ideas on his own. What people want today, Tacitus says, to use a term of our own day, are sound bites. They want advertising slogans, so they don't have to think. And this goes back to education. The great orators of our past, Cicero says, in the words of Tacitus, the great orators of our past, Cicero tells us, were men of education. And Tacitus says, look at Cicero, how he studied and learned philosophy, history. And when he speaks, it is not because he has had some commercial education in communication. It is out of this wealth of knowledge and moral principles. Because no speaker can be persuasive ultimately unless that man builds his words and thoughts upon unswerving moral principles. And in our own day, Tacitus says, who has moral principles? So the lack of oratory is but a symptom of our own lack of concern with principles and real political issues. We might ask ourselves the question, how many great orators are there today in the early 21st century? How much does real oratory play a role in the politics of our day? That was not true in 1776. Men like Patrick Henry swayed colonies with speeches that had such ringing words as "Give me liberty or give me death." Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, which summarized for a nation why it was fighting this great Civil War. But these were ages that spoke out of principle and not out of expediency. In his study of the Germans, Tacitus opened up for the Romans the world of that brave people that could not be conquered by the Romans, whose love of freedom was so great that they would die rather than accept slavery. And the theme is, we were once like that. We once preferred freedom to slavery. Now we prefer security and prosperity. We were once chaste, like the Germans, morally pure and virtuous. But for us today, he says, to be adulterous is to be chic and a la mode. And his life of his father-in-law, Julius Agricola, Gnaeus Julius Agricola, shows that a man of virtue, like his father-in-law, imbued with the old-fashioned ways, cannot ultimately be successful in the corrupt world of a Domitian. Agricola would lead the armies of Rome to the very ends of the island of Britain. He had within his grasp the conquest of Britain and of Ireland. And such was the jealousy of Domitian, for a tyrant is threatened by greatness, that Agricola was brought back. And such was the pride of Agricola that he would not beg a tyrant to go back and complete what he was the only man really to do, nor would he even accept a salary as a retirement boon. And so, still today, says Tacitus, Ireland lies outside our control, and Britain only half conquered. And in this life of Agricola, Tacitus passes his own judgment on this empire, for which we have sacrificed so much. We gave up freedom in order to maintain our empire, is what Tacitus says. We accepted a Caesar because he could keep our empire, and we thought that more important. But what is our empire? And he allows a chieftain of the Caledonians, in the land that we call Scotland today, to speak out right before the climactic battle with Agricola. Calgacus is the chieftain's name. The Romans are but robbers and plunderers, and their empire is nothing more than organized plunder. They come to reduce the world to slavery. If it is rich enough, an area, they will conquer it for its plunder. And if it is poor, like us, they conquer it just out of the lust for power. They have reduced the Gauls to slavery. They want to reduce the Germans to slavery, and now they have come to the ends of the earth, and a land so alien to them, just out of their lust for power. They make a desert, and they call it peace. That is not Calgacus, that is Tacitus speaking on an empire that is corrupt and without meaning. And then, in his greatest work, his Annals, he describes the origin of this empire. People have been afraid, he said, up until now, to write about the origins of this system of Augustus. I write without partisanship or anger. I simply tell you how it was. And I tell you about Augustus. He does it without repeating the same moral judgments over and over again. He lets the deeds of Augustus speak for him. How Augustus won over the soldiers by gifts, the people with cheap bread, and everybody with the repose of peace. He set up what he called a principate, but it was in fact an imperial monarchy, rooted in hypocrisy, founded in fraud and violence. He was himself, Augustus, the arch hypocrite. And we accepted his system because we were no longer worthy of freedom. We were no longer morally worthy of it. So can we be surprised that when he dies, we get a monster like Tiberius, a lunatic like Caligula, a fool like Claudius, or a vicious buffoon like Nero? Once we stepped through the tyrant's door, once we accepted security over liberty, then our choices were gone. And Tacitus, the philosophical historian, would echo down through the centuries. Edward Gibbon would take him as his master. And in 1776, the House of Parliament would ring with the words of Gibbon. Words echoing down the centuries in which a people, the Romans, had once sold away their liberty for security. And Americans would see in the words of Gibbon and of Tacitus a warning to them. And Thomas Jefferson would say of Tacitus that he was a combination of historical learning and moral wisdom without parallel.